I was raised in a religious cult. I was raised in a high control religious cult that preached fire and brimstone. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was a cult leader. We'd call him a preacher, I suppose, but he was a cult leader. The thing that was used to control us was fear. And I'm sure you've all heard the cliche phrase, fear is a powerful motivator. And that is extremely true. The thing about fear is it engages a part of the brain that actively starts searching for predictable patterns. The unfortunate thing is that, especially if you have something like complex PTSD or PTSD, which most people who've lived in any kind of cult situation do have this, the brain, when it's searching for these predictable patterns, it doesn't always choose what's safest because sometimes what's familiar and more predictable seems like it's going to be easier to control because there's history supporting this. And so if you've ever been in any kind of abusive relationship, these are often known by cult scholars and people who have studied organizational psychology and psychology, sociology, things like that, as a one-to-one cult, because it's the same patterns, it's the same dynamics that are used, and fear is a pivotal and essential part of that foundation. The sort of mentality that fear-based kind of sociological and psychological control incite is this almost me first mentality. And it's an attempt for the brain to kind of engage some sort of preventative control, when the reality is that someone else who is perhaps more vulnerable than you is likely going to be affected before you actually are. But your brain is searching for this pattern of predictability. What can I hold on to that I have a history of that maybe I can control and maintain my safety? Now, it's important to emphasize here that safety is perceived. This is perceived safety because complex PTSD can give you some beautiful tools and beautiful intuition to use to your benefit and for your safety. However, when fear is engaged, it can also be quite an ungrounding experience. And so you can only see in front of you when this sort of mentality gets engaged, you can only see what you perceive as an immediate threat. Welcome to the Love Brought You Here podcast, where I talk about love through creativity as an act of rebellion. My name is Cassandra, and I'm your host. I want to go back to this idea of talking about perceived immediate danger when survival mode is engaged. If you think about the most on the nose example of PTSD or complex PTSD, I usually think about and use the example of a soldier in a war zone. So a soldier is placed in a situation where he or she, they are being directly threatened and attacked by, let's say, someone with a bayonet coming directly at them in the middle of a war zone. That becomes their focus. The person with the bayonet who is coming towards them, who is an immediate threat, at least through the perception of the mind, and in this case, this would be real, that is their immediate threat. And so the brain begins to block everything else out so that it can focus. The brain and survival mode is a really cool thing. The reason things like frostbite happen is because when the brain starts to perceive danger of freezing, it starts to take blood away from the non-vital organs and the non-vital parts of your body, starting with things like your fingers and your toes, because your organs are far more important than your fingers and your toes. And so something similar happens when you see immediate danger in front of you in these war zones. Now, while this is happening, your brain is, again, blocking everything out. And that is a beautiful thing. It's a safety thing. It engages almost like a tunnel vision scenario where you're focused on what's directly in front of you that is bringing you, that your brain is perceiving as a threat. Now, of course, this is helpful when you're in the situation, but with PTSD, it becomes ungrounding and disorienting when you're not in an actually unsafe situation, or when you're in a situation that perhaps your brain is perceiving as unsafe, but in reality, that's just your brain looking for this pattern of predictability. You might actually have time to sit down and think. And also, when you're not in immediate danger, or when you are in immediate danger, the brain likely does not see the field of flowers that's around you. It's only focused on the person with the bayonet. It might not see the person lying in the field of flowers who is actually wounded and therefore far more vulnerable and in more danger than you actually are. Today, I wanted to talk about the Olmstead opinions through this lens. And I think it's important to note that the Olmstead is just an opinion. This is not new law that has been signed into effect yet. This is something that the DOJ wrote. I'm not saying don't pay attention whatsoever, but I think that it is important not to incite this mass hysteria and this fear that can actually cause us to forget what's important, what's immediate in front of us, and who is in the most immediate danger. Now, to the mass hysteria that I talked about at the beginning with the fire and the brimstone, what does that have to do with anything? I think that as a society, that those of us who are paying attention to this opinion, again, an opinion set forth by the DOJ, are sometimes acting on this mass hysteria. Let me back up for just a second. Let's talk about what the Olmstead actually is. It was it's a piece of legislature that was introduced in 1999, and this was the disabilities. Um, so people with disabilities are now, because of this law, they are integrated into society instead of being institutionalized, of course, as it's available and appropriate to do so. Why is this important? Well, we think about segregation in racial aspects, and that was one of the most egregious forms of segregation before the civil rights movement. And then also, if you think about the Japanese internment camps, that segregation, what we've done to indigenous people is a type of segregation when we forced them onto reservations and stole their land. But also the way that we treated people with disabilities was segregation. We would put them in an institution and not give them the ability to live among other people who actually they could benefit from having quote unquote normal interactions. Now, I want to give you a little piece of history about myself. If you've followed me for long, you know that I had an older sister named Damaris, and she had profound intellectual and physical disabilities. And what does that mean? Profound intellectual and disabilities, if you're not familiar, is actually in her case, she needed to wear adult incontinent briefs. She had to be fed. She could not feed herself. She had to have all of her needs met by someone else. She could not take care of herself. She was intellectually like a child, like a very young child, perhaps, under 1 year old. She could not communicate using words. And so she was a very special individual, and we would call her someone who requires high support. And so I grew up around this, and consequently, most of my professional life was spent working in the field of adults specifically with disabilities. And so I have gained through that experience and through living with my sister quite a bit of insight. And this is a piece of history and a piece of what's happening now that is very near and dear to my heart. And I want to reiterate the fact that I said I don't want people to panic right now. If you're listening to this, I want you to pay attention, but I don't want you to panic. I want you to think about the fact that Nazi Germany did not happen overnight. Now, that's kind of a double-edged sword, but it didn't. People were having rights taken away left and right. And I can't say for sure what the trending social reaction was back then. But what I see now is when this starts to happen, people begin to panic. And people become, especially when this like me first sort of mentality is incited, people begin to think, oh my God, well, I'm disabled, I am neurodivergent, or I am a person with a disability living in society. And that's fair and that's valid. But again, We need to take a look at who's being affected most by this right now. Because what happens, I'm neurodivergent. Am I going to be thrown in an institution because of that? Maybe one day if this is allowed to continue. But am I in danger of this right now? Again, this is just an opinion that was set forth by the administration. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it sets the stage for some very dangerous things to happen. It's a precedent for a lot of horribleness. But right now, the people who are in danger of losing their access to being in community, in danger of being resegregated, it's not me. It's probably not you if you're listening to this podcast. It's people like my sister who are a lot more vulnerable. It's people, the people who are going to suffer are caregivers for individuals like this. Now, as I go through this today, I'm going to give you some information. I'm going to give you some statistics. I was doing a lot of research on this and I thought about spitting out, a bunch of facts and a bunch of data. And I am going to do some of that, but I'm also just going to provide you with the resources that I've used. And so I'll try to provide those links in the identifying section that's attached to the podcast. Also, you can check out my Substack for more information about it. Either is a viable option. And please excuse me while I'm looking at my notes on my tiny screen of my phone. But I want you to think about people like my sister. Now, my situation was a little bit different. My sister actually had money to pay for some of her care. But a direct quote from RFK Jr., let me just read to you what he recently said within the past month or so. And he's talking specifically about things like waivers. Now, waivers are programs that are set up so that individuals with any kind of special needs, this can be like I'm most familiar with the disabilities waivers, but it can also refer to someone who is taking care of an elderly parent, any kind of situation where someone's getting care at home. Waiver provides an opportunity to be paid to do this. So if you have an adult disabled child who you stay at home and provide care for, particularly if they're high support, like my sister was, you can get paid to do this. And we'll talk about why that's important in just a moment. But RFK Jr., which I don't know who put him in charge, but I don't know. The man handles poisonous snakes. Growing up in a cult that handled poisonous snakes and drank poison, I have very little regard for anyone who does that. I have very little use for anyone who does that. And to put him in charge of, no. Anyway, a direct quote from RFK Jr. The waiver allow people, family members who are taking care of an elderly parent to get paid for balancing the checkbook, for picking up groceries, for driving somebody to a doctor's appointment. He said during a Ways and Means Committee hearing. Today, the biggest job in New York, 650,000 people, the biggest employment niche is home care. These are family members who are getting paid to do things that they used to do as family members for free. And this is rife with fraud because when we have no way at CMS to determine if they actually performed that duty or not. First and foremost, yes, people are getting paid to do things like take their loved one to pick up their mail, to balance a checkbook. Because if they don't, then who's going to do it? An institution is going to cost far more. In fact, waiver usually pays on average like 18 to 20 bucks, and I'll provide some information about that too. And it goes state by state. It's not like you're getting much above a standard cost of living. In some areas, it's only like $15 an hour. There are also caps on these hours. Like there's a maximum amount that you can actually get paid for per week. So first of all, someone actually needs to do this. And if you are a person who's trying to work, how are you going to work and be able to do these things, especially if someone has high support needs? You're not going to be able to do that. And by the way, institutions lie about performing duties all the time. My father was in a facility for a while after he could no longer take care of himself. And the amount of times that caregivers would sign off on saying that he had bathed, that he had done certain ADLs, or that they had helped That was a complete lie, a complete and utter lie. The man had not bathed in probably 6, 7 months. He would tell you, and also you could smell it. It's absurd. Like institutions, I managed institutions, an institution like this. I've worked places like this as direct care. I've seen the fraud. Just because you're at an institution does not mean that the checks and balances mean anything more than at the home. So it's very easy to just sign off on paperwork. I've seen plenty of people do it. I've experienced this firsthand. So that is just absurd. While paperwork is required in institutions, there's just very little access to actual proof that anything has happened. We, the people, just have to pay a much higher cost for these lies in an institutional setting than we would at home, where you're barely, again, getting paid a living wage. So there's that. Employment, while caring for a high support needs individual, is almost impossible. The call outs, if you're trying to take care of someone and let's say you're hiring someone to come in and help with this individual, if they call out, you have to call out of your job. I mean, the number of times that my father had a job and was trying to take care of my sister at the same time, and the caregiver would just call out, is ridiculous. Like, eventually you just get fired. You can't keep doing it. There are healthcare worker shortages. Have you ever been to a hospital? Have you ever been to a nursing home? I mean, just a hospital alone where you have more acute needs. I've been hospitalized. I was hospitalized over the winter, and just getting to the bathroom, and these are with really good nurses and really good caregivers. Just getting to the bathroom sometimes took 15, 20 minutes. There are a lot of healthcare shortages. And when you're talking about people who are going to work with these individuals who have so many needs, it's very difficult to get, especially quality of care. There's a lot of hiring people off the street with no experience already. And it's just really hard. Sometimes there are medical requirements that to institutionalize someone is not always a good option. Like the level of care that someone would get at home, usually, not always. Of course, there's nothing that is just a blanket statement, but usually far exceeds anything that would happen in an institution. My mother actually made a lot of really difficult decisions when she knew that she was really sick and wasn't going to make it, because she knew that my sister would not make it in an institution. And the best thing, or the only thing that was going to happen, was that we would be split apart. You know, again, I've mentioned the hourly caps that happen. A lot of times it could be 40 hours a week. That's all that these waivers pay for. It's not like this huge amount of money like RFK Jr. is making it out to be. I think in Colorado, it's 56 hours a week. And of course, there's some assessment. It's varies state by state, but there are absolute maximums. So again, it's not even like someone's getting paid just all these extra hours for duties. Uh, does the potential for fraud exist? Absolutely. The potential for fraud exists in everything. There's always going to be fraud somewhere along the line. It's statistically insignificant in this situation, but I just want to point out that there are people influencing laws about health and healthcare, RFK Jr., who have actually no credentials to be doing so. That seems pretty fraudulent, actually. There are people running the country who are fraudulently covering up their participation in child trafficking. So I digress. There's always fraudulent activity happening. You can't just say that the program isn't good. Also, there are long wait lists for these programs. I know that for my sister, I think she was on a waiver wait list eventually for a year. And that wasn't actually that long. What had happened in the state that I was in, West Virginia, was that the governor decided to clear out the list and go ahead and push people on. And so that expedited it. That does not always happen. In fact, that rarely happens. And often these long waiting lists actually cause such a financial burden that by the time these people get access to the waiver to be paid by Medicaid or by the state, they're already broke, they're already struggling to make ends meet. If you're a high functioning adult with a disability, like I said, you're not going to get thrown into an institution immediately. This isn't something that is an immediate threat to you. It is an immediate threat to people like my sister, to people who are on the autism spectrum, who they're trying to live at home with a caregiver, a sibling, a parent, whomever. And suddenly they don't have money. Again, if you can't go to work, how are you supposed to pay for these the needs to take care of someone? Also, there's a lot of adaptive equipment that's needed that often insurance doesn't even pay for. So that is an extra cost of keeping someone at home. And when I say adaptive equipment, I mean things that people don't think about. My sister, for example, needed a special cup. We called them nosy cups. They had the nose cut out because if you've ever tried to give someone a drink from a cup because she couldn't drink herself, it's kind of awkward and you almost end up drowning them. And so you need an adaptive cup. If someone's able to feed themselves, but perhaps they don't have the best agility with their hands, there are special plates that have raised brims, special spoons that have larger grips so that someone can eat like this instead of if they don't have the dexterity. There's all sorts of adaptive equipment that often is not paid for even by the best insurance. And that is an additional cost that's not getting covered by insurance, that's the family or the caregiver, whatever the situation is, whoever's trying to keep the people at home and integrated into society. These are additional costs. Furthermore, the mental health impact of taking an individual who already has difficulties perhaps adjusting to a normal society and isolating them in an institution, those ramifications are significant. And a quality of life, it just, it diminishes. And I'm not saying that people don't need community of with like similar abilities or disabilities, as the case may be. But to say that they have to be institutionalized, I want to give you an example. I was actually, I don't want to use the word institutionalized, but I I chose to be part of a program. It was actually a trafficking recovery program. And the way that they ran it was, I don't trust any of these programs, quite honestly, but that's for another day. But they kind of packed everybody up in a van every day, and we all went and did the same thing. We couldn't have cell phones. We couldn't have access to a computer. Like we couldn't even use Google or check our email for the duration of this program. I left, kind of got kicked out because I'm a bit rebellious. And I was like, this is crazy. You guys are trying to reprogram people for your own wants and needs. But in any event, again, that's for another day. We can talk about it later. But just the flattening of personhood that happens in things like that. And me as a fully functional, fully cognizant, coherent, able to move through the world as if I'm fine, I'm adaptable, that the mental ramifications, the mental health that the toll and the impact that that took on me was incredible. To just be treated like a number of, come on, let's pack you up. To lose your individualization, your identity. It's almost like they're taking more of your identity in order to quote unquote rehabilitate you. And that's something similar that happens in these institutions, except these people aren't even going to have the choice to go there. They'll just be thrown in and further stripped of their personhood. That breaks my heart. Again, there's something to be said for community, but that's actually crazy to me. Medicaid cuts, if this opinion by the DOJ actually is impactful and changes things, Medicaid cuts are going to make it so that the individuals can't even afford to keep these people at home. These people with special needs who lives are so enriched by their interactions with family and whose families' lives are so enriched. Emotional abuse is statistically more likely. There are all kinds of abuse that are statistically more likely in institutions, including sexual abuse. And I actually looked up a lot of the statistics about this. Um, In fact, the higher support needs that someone has, the more likely they are to be sexually assaulted in an institution. I'm not saying that doesn't happen at home. It certainly does. It happened to my sister, but it is less likely statistically. And I think that forcing people into these institutions where there are higher overhead costs, again, you're hiring people off the street. Sure, you can do background checks. Background checks only work for people who've been caught. And background checks, often the kinds that they do at these places, they don't go very deep because that's too expensive. God forbid. God forbid we look into things. So you're lacking in individualized care also that looks into like what's going to be best for this particular person. What are their interests that they like? Because you're just packed into a van and taken on a field trip every now and then. And again, I've done this professionally. I've seen the real life, real time, what happens. And I'm not saying that places aren't doing their best and that people aren't doing their best. And sometimes they're not. But I am saying I want you to stop and think about the real life things that are happening, not what could happen to you. And that is important, of course, because it's the saying is, I'm gonna flub it, so I'm not going to try, but they came for so and so's rights and I was silent. And that's how it keeps going until there was no one to speak for me either. And so I think it's very important that we do pay attention. But to incite a riot right now to say, oh my God, they're coming for me, they're going to lock me up. No, they're not right now. Can that happen? We use the analogy of a frog in a boiling pot quite often for narcissistic abuse. And this is just a zoomed out form of narcissistic abuse. If you watched my episode with Jewel, where we talked about the need for resources and independence in resources, because once someone starts to control your resources, they have power over you. If you looked out at the zoomed out version of this analogy that I'm about to give you, of a frog in a pot of water, the frog doesn't know that he's in a boiling pot of water because it gets heated up very slowly. And that's why it is important to pay attention. But it's also important not to freak out right now, not to go straight to fire and brimstone. Oh my God, I'm going to die. You're not. This is an opinion, not a law change right now. But what I need you to keep focus on, some of the best information and best advice that I've ever gotten were from Black and Indigenous women, particularly Black women in this case. Because I've seen Black women who are counseling white women who are becoming activists in particularly the racial world, in the world of things like civil rights. And the one thing that they always say is you have to remain calm. Now, for a Black woman, this is particularly important because if not, she'll be labeled as an aggressive Black woman and completely discredited. But I want you to look at, in general, the way that abuse works, because it's all the same pattern. Again, the way that we brought slaves here, the way that we thought that we could own someone else, and the tactics that we use is just more watered down now, a more watered down version. And I'm not equating interpersonal abuse to slavery. I'm saying it's the same patterns that are used. But what happens when you become triggered and reactive to some sort of abuse? You're made to look like the crazy person. So it is very important to be measured, and not just this, not just these disability acts that are trying to be influenced and changed and whatever else, the Medicaid cuts, not just in this, but as changes continue to roll out, because we know this administration, this isn't the first or last thing that's going to happen. It's so important to be measured and to be calm and to also not look away, because what happens when you become so reactive to a situation that you're, oh my God, I'm going to be locked up, I'm going to be institutionalized, I'm going to die, and you start to panic. For a moment, you're reactive. For a moment, you're focused on the bayonet in front of you. But you can only hold that pace for so long before you become tired. And when you become tired, you start to rest and you start to lose focus on what the initial problem was in the first place. So by the time the pot starts to boil, you're not paying attention. That's why I want you to not panic now. I want you to keep paying attention. And I want you to have the energy to continue to pay attention, because otherwise the pot's going to be boiling and then it will be you. And you'll go, oh my God, where did this come from? Just like I mentioned Nazi Germany earlier. It didn't happen overnight, but likely people began to panic and then lost sight of things. And honestly, as an institution, as like a system, that's what everyone's banking on. Why do you think that a lot of things happen all at once institutionally when, there's a war all of a sudden, there's this, there's that. There's too much to pay attention to. People get tired and just kind of dissociate and stop paying attention in general. I feel like this has been a little bit all over the place. This is also a reminder, though, of love through creativity. For me, this is one of my contributions. I realized the other day that I was being too strict with what I labeled as creativity. I am a creative mind, and that doesn't just apply to writing. I had it in my mind that I had to sit down and write an essay every single day. And I do need structure, and I'm still working to achieve that. I think we all could use some structure in our creative processes. It's important. But also, I do photography. I speak. I do podcasting. I journal. I can draw. I do videos. I was trying to sit down and label my creativity each day as one particular thing. Sit down, hammer out an essay, or write this particular amount of time, blah, blah, blah. That's not what it looks like. For me today, this is me fighting with creativity through podcasting. And it feels weird because it doesn't feel that creative. I feel like I haven't been my most articulate, but you know what? I'm speaking. I'm using my critical thinking. I'm using my mind, and I'm doing it out of love. Love for myself, love for my sister. And by the way, if you'd like to see more about my sister, learn more about my sister, I encourage you to check out either my personal page, my Instagram page, or my Love Brought You Here podcast on Instagram page. I'll link everything. Don't worry. I'll put a link tree. I also have a YouTube page for the Love Brought You Here podcast. And that will also have a video about my sister on it. It's just a 30-second video, and it shows you a little bit about her and how special she was. But so this is my creative endeavor for today. This is what I am using my creative rebellion to do. I'm using my voice today, and that's enough. I want you to think about how you can use creativity to benefit yourself, to fight some of the things that are coming. And this is also a reminder that we often as a society confuse unity, the concept of unity, with being homogenous. Not everyone has to fight in the same way. Even radical movements end up doing this. And I often say it ends up being one and the same because everyone's expected to do the same thing. It's just usually packaged a little bit differently. Everyone's expected to protest with their dollars in the same way. That's not a reality. I'm someone who's been homeless, I've been poor, I've been wealthy. It's not a reality for someone who's homeless to protest with their money the same way that someone who was sitting pretty like I was before I experienced homelessness. And so I want you to use your creativity authentically and don't expect someone else to do the same. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you choose to do something today. Regardless of the topic that you choose, I hope you choose to do something today. Let your inner child out. Let your inner child say what they want to say. My inner child wanted to stand up for my sister today. My sister didn't have words to communicate. And so this is on her behalf. This is on behalf of my mother, who had to make some very difficult choices because she didn't have support. She didn't have access to programs and things that could have helped. I just want you to remember that love brought you here. And if you've trusted love this far, don't panic now. Those are the words of James Baldwin, who I try to channel every week when I do an episode. I hope I've given you some food for thought this week, and I hope that you'll join me again in the next episode of Love Brought You Here. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you again soon.